Good afternoon, my name is Lisa Houghton, and today in this presentation I am going to demonstrate my understanding of theories relating to cognitive development and learning by evaluating experiments that support Pigot's view as well as comparing structuralist theories. Pigot was the first theorist to suggest the way children think is fundamentally different from the way adults think, and believed it was linked to the age, and he constructed several experiments to explore the different stages. He claimed that they learnt through their play and construct their knowledge and understanding based on their own experiences. Pigot broke this down into three main components: schema, adaptation, and stages of development. On this next slide, it outlines the four different stages of development and the experiments which supported Pigot's views. In the first stage, this is known as the object permanence, and this is when knowing that the object still exists even if it cannot be seen, and also this is when learning takes place through touching, feeling and seeing. Pigot's experiment for this stage was to hide a toy under a blanket whilst the child was still watching. Pigot assumed that the child could only search for the hidden toy if they had mental representation of it. Pigot demonstrated that infants who lacked object permanence tend to demonstrate that the toy no longer existed, and they lost interest as they no longer had a mental representation of the toy in their minds. Infants that had developed object permanence would lift the blanket and look for the toy. Pigot found that this happened around 8 months old and concluded this is when infants developed object permanence. On the next stage was the pre-operational stage, and this is where Pigot believed that it is not yet capable of logical thinking. This is when children began to understand that others had a view and language to express themselves. Children are unable to use logic and reasoning, and Pigot's description of children at this stage were egocentric, as they had a tendency to see the world only from their point of view. Pigot ran several conservational experiments to demonstrate this through number, volume, mass and length, and one of his most famous experiments was using different shapes of glasses but with the same amount of water. The child could not understand that if you pour water from a short, wide glass into a tall, narrow glass, it was still the same amount of water, whatever. In our next stage, we got the children couldn't think more logically about objects, but still very rigid, but also started using reasoning to help them solve their problems. At this stage, they begin to understand their thoughts are unique and can show empathy to others, so they became less egocentric. Pigot believed that children at this stage were good at inductive logic, but also they can have problems with deductive logic. Transitivity it was the ability to understand logical relationships between different things. Seriation was the ability to sort objects according to different criteria. Reversibility is when children are aware that actions can be reversed. And classification. Children can sort objects according to different characters, i.e. shapes, colours, could have different lengths, how many sides, etc. One of the classic tests used at this stage is the Sally-Ann test, where Sally doll had a basket and a marble, and the Ann doll had a box. Sally places the marble in the basket and leaves the room. While she's gone, Ann moves the marble to the box. The child is asked where Sally would look for the marble when she returned. Ideally, the child should say the basket, as that is where Sally had left it. Pigot demonstrated children's logical thinking with experiments, and there are many examples of these on the internet. There was one where there is a bottle with a water line and then another bottle tilted. Pigot concluded that children at this stage would be able to draw a water line in the correct place. And our last stage of the cognitive development is the formal operational stage from adolescence to adulthood, and this is where abstract thinking and verbal reasoning started to develop. At this stage, Pigot believed that children now had the ability to sustain abstract concepts, able to plan systematically and use logical thinking. At this stage, they can now think of possible ways of solving the problem at hand. The known test for this was the pendulum experiment, which consisted of 3 factors: the length of string, weight of the object at the end of the pendulum, and the force of which was pushed. Pigot asked children to test these different factors to determine how fast the pendulum would swing. Children at this stage would hopefully think the task through. logically. In the next slides, I am going to talk about the theory and practice of classical and operant conditioning using Pavlov and Skinner for examples. Pavlov was well known for studying a dog's response when being fed. His research indicated that by representing a dog with food would provoke an unconditional response in the form of the dog salivating. However, if the addition of a bell was added, there would be no reaction from the dog. To condition the dog would be to ring the bell simultaneously whilst offering food, and the dog will salivate. Although after repeating this and then remove the food, the dog will still salivate even when there is no food offered. Pavlov referred to this to classical conditioning because the dog has now been conditioned to associate food with the sound of the bell. There were criticisms of Pavlov's theories as he did not take into consideration individuals' own uniqueness and how they may choose their own destiny. With Skinner was operant conditioning. Skinner designed several devices to use for his experiments. The most famous was the Skinner box. Rats were added to the box and accidentally they pressed the lever, which then gave them food, rewarded them with food and water, which is known as the positive reinforcement. However, if they travelled around the wrong way, they would receive an electric shock, which he called negative reinforcement, where the likelihood of poor behaviour can be discouraged through pairing it with an unpleasant consequence, the electric shock. However, this positive reinforcement does not work very well for humans. If a human was punished, they are still likely to repeat the behaviour. They may not really be bothered by the reward. Ways in which behaviourist techniques are employed in an educational setting. According to many behaviourists, behaviour is learned, as we saw with Pavlov and Skinner experiments. With children, we can see this if at the beginning of term a child was able to recite the 8 timetables, but after continuous lessons, etc., they can now recite them. Operant conditioning, the child's behaviour proves they are learning. To encourage the child to keep practicing the times tables, the teacher can offer a reward of something the individual would like. This can be dependent on the age. So for the younger ones, they would like a reward sticker, move up the award board, but for the older ones, it can still work by giving them merits and house points. This will also encourage other learners who may also be finding the task difficult. They will want to receive positive reinforcement from the teacher. Positive reinforcement will have a longer lasting effect than negative reinforcement. If a child is misbehaving, the teacher can shape the child's behaviour in small steps. They can offer rewards for better behaviour, but they can do it in increments. The teacher should encourage the children to discuss what problems they have with the subject matter. It may be they can recite the 8 times tables, but fear of being asked one ad hoc, they panic, and the mind goes into complete blank. A teacher can help the child by removing the negative responses, by building up the difficulty of the task. If the fear is getting the question incorrect, then the teacher could ask the child some of the easier times tables to which they know the child will achieve, and then give them praise. The praise and encouragement will condition the child, and they will then look forward to the times tables and not fear being asked a question. And this is the classical conditioning. We now have a comparison of contrasting structuralist theories of cognitive development using experimental examples. Pigot's theory differs from other theorists. His study was only on children's development rather than what they learn. Bandura believed in social learning, whereby the learning happens as a result of observing others, such as parents, teachers, and friends, etc. Whereby Pigot believed that they think differently to the way adults think, and believes it was linked with the age, as we discussed earlier. Bandura studied children's behaviour through his Bobo doll experiment. A group of children watched adults physically and mentally attack an inflatable doll, and another group watched adults act affectionately to the doll. When the children were left alone, they intimidated the behaviour of the adults they'd just observed. So the ones that observed the adults being aggressive, they they imitated that, and the ones that was affectionate, they done that. Bandura recognised 3 models of observational learning which can influence children both positively and negatively. A live model, this is a mother and she could be carrying out her household duties, and this is where the child would copy. A verbal instructional model, this could be a teacher giving instructions and the child performs appropriate behaviour to those instructions. And then a symbolic model, characters displaying different behaviours on a TV programme. Vygotsky's theory was social cultural, whereby cognitive growth came from social interaction with family, friends, teachers and peers. He believed children learn from most knowledgeable others through social interaction as being in the zone of proximal development. Now we have the critical common terms with these learning theories. We've been through lots of different learning theories and now we've got some critical views on them. So first of all, we've got the extinction, and this is in classical conditioning where the learned behaviour can now also be unlearned. Okay, operant conditioning, this focuses on voluntary behaviour and can be used positively or negatively. Positive reinforcement increases positive behaviour, but children will ignore if not good enough. So if the reward's not good enough, they'll ignore it. Negative reinforcement increases the possibility that the behaviour will be repeated, and they're doing it for attention. They like it because they're doing it for attention. Sanctions, this is not the same as negative reinforcement. Sanctions are consequences and only will be effective if the child's behaviour actually changes. There are 2 common mistakes for misusing reinforcement and sanctions: ignoring the behaviour that deserves reinforcement and confusing sanctions and reinforcement. Then we have continuous reinforcement. It needs to be all the time and immediately reinforced. Sometimes this can be forgotten. Intermittent reinforcement, must be careful not to move the goalpost and confuse the child what you are trying to achieve. And then we have our last one, which is shaping. Shaping can be used negatively, so must reinforce all efforts by the children. That concludes my presentation. I hope this information is useful to you. Is there any questions from the audience? Thank you very much.